Good morning, and welcome to the Residual Noise Conference at Brown University. I'm Ed Osborne, Associate Professor of Visual Art and Music at Brown. Residual Noise is a sound studies and sonic practice conference that focuses on a concise set of perspectives in current discourse on contemporary sonic practice from both scholarly and creative standpoints. The title is the term for the noise level left on a recording tape after it's been erased. It also is used as a reference to the background or ambient sounds that are present but not actively listened to, and that have a pronounced effect on the local acoustic terrain. This conference takes the idea of this kind of sound, one that has a presence but is also subject to a kind of erasure, as a springboard for consideration of how sonic practices and audio cultures utilize and navigate this form of acoustic space. The conference was originally set for March 13th of this year, but had to be rescheduled due to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are fortunate that nearly everyone whom we had asked to participate then could be part of this event today. The changes brought about by the pandemic in the last 7 months have, of course, been substantial, and they have manifested in many ways related to sound and sonic culture. Seemingly overnight, the levels of ambient sound in cities dropped in tangible ways, offering new opportunities for listening and navigation. This reduction in the noise floor brought with it transformation of both acoustic spaces and social spaces for sound making, and the reconfigured reality, sonic and otherwise, is reflected in the content of the work and research presented today. The earlier configuration of the conference had 2 concerts planned, one at the Granoff Center here at Brown, and the other at the Spatial Audio Studio at the Rhode Island School of Design. Both concerts featured multi-channel work, and the pieces set to be performed at RISD were to be heard through their new 25-channel ambisonic system. The spatial qualities of the pieces to be presented at both venues only partly translate into the online and stereo setting that will be heard in the concert this evening. Some of the artists on the program have mixed their pieces into a binaural format for the occasion. Others have opted to present different work that fits better with the new presentation format. Here, I have to give acknowledgement and a big note of appreciation and thanks to Sean Greenlee at RISD, who's done a great deal of work to make the Spatial Audio Studio a reality and to put together the concert that was planned to take place there last March and subsequently transformed into the one that is set for this evening. We hope that future Sonic Arts events here at Brown and RISD will be able to take advantage of that facility and that we can gather there to experience the works in a really wonderful listening space. Residual Noise is presented with the support of the Brown Arts Initiative, the Music Department, and the Visual Art Department, and the Rhode Island School of Design Program for Experimental and Foundation Studies. I'd like to thank the staff of the BAI for their help in making this happen: Sean Tavares, Greg Picard, Sofia Lacava-Bohannon, and Kira Del Sesto. I'd also like to thank the staff at the Music Department, Lauren Bitzali, Drew Mosier, and Jan Vieira, for their work, especially all the work earlier this year that went into preparing for the in-person version of this conference. I'd also like to thank the heads of the Brown Arts Initiative, the Music and Visual Art Departments, respectively, Talia Fields, Emily Dolan, and Leslie Bostrom, for their support and encouragement of this event. Today's event consists of 2 panels, one this morning that I will introduce in a moment, and one this afternoon at 1 o'clock featuring Marcel Zais and Clara Latham. The concert tonight will premiere on BAI's YouTube channel at 8 p.m. and will feature the work of Mike Bullock, Rachel Devora, Lee Gilboa, Erik Leon, and Daphne Neftali. This morning's panel includes presentations by Erik Deluca and Elana Hausknecht, Enongo, Lumumba-Kasongo, and Stefan Moore. This will be followed by a discussion moderated by Christina Warren. Erik Deluca is an artist and musician working with performance, sculpture, text, and social practice. He's lectured, performed, and exhibited at a variety of places, including Mass MoCA, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Sweet Pass Sculpture Park, the Contemporary Austin, the Living Art Museum in Iceland, the Columbia School of the Fine Arts, and Fieldwork, Marfa. He received a PhD from the University of Virginia, lectured at the Iceland University of the Arts in Iceland, and was visiting assistant professor of music and multimedia at Brown University from 2018 to 2020. He currently teaches in the Experimental and Foundation Studies at the Rhode Island School of Design. Elana Hausknecht is an undergraduate studying music and urban studies at Brown University. Currently, she's been taking time away from school to work in public parks with AmeriCorps and more recently to participate in political organizing in Rhode Island and New York. Elana plays trumpet with Mariachi de Brown, rides Saripta, dialogues through and about writing, and listens to construction sites. She and Erik Deluca will jointly present Ears to the Ground, Public Art in Sound, Listening, and Collective Voice. Enongo Lumumba-Kasongo, aka Samus, is a rap artist and producer from Ithaca, New York, with a PhD in Science and Technology Studies from Cornell University. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Brown in the music department. Since 2010, Samus has written, produced, and recorded 3 full-length albums, 3 EPs, a collaborative video game-themed concept album with MC Megaran, a critically acclaimed beat tape, and countless one-off collaborations with artists from a variety of genres. Her story as an artist at the intersections of academia and Afrofuturism has led to performances and speaking engagements at a range of conferences, conventions, festivals, and campus events. She's an audio director at Glow Up Games and co-hosts the podcast Zero Suits. Stefan Moore is a sound artist, designer, composer, improviser, coder, teacher, and curator based in Chicago. His creative work manifests as electronic studio compositions, improvisational outbursts, sound installations, scores for collaborative performances, algorithmic compositions, interactive art, and sound designs for unusual circumstances. He's the curator of sound art for the Carrymore Center of Music and the Arts, organizing annual exhibitions since 2014. He's also the president of Isabel Audio, which builds and sells his Hemisphere loudspeakers. He was the music coordinator and touring sound engineer of the Merce Cunningham Dance Company from 2004 to 2010, and has worked with Pauline Oliveros, Anthony McCall, and Animal Collective, among many others. He's senior lecturer in the Sound Arts and Industries program at Northwestern University. He'll be talking on transforming urban noise. Christina Warren is a composer, improviser, and maker. She writes and performs acoustic and electronic sound using instruments she's and others made. Her first solo album, Filament, from 2019, is described as precise, unpredictable, and making repeat listens irresistible, while her bespoke wearable electronic instrument, Exo Rosie, sees her rolling around on the floor. Warren has presented her work at the Chamber Music Conference of the East, the Guthman Musical Instrument Competition, Espèce des Arts Sans Frontières in France, and Music Festival, the Movement and Computing Conference in the U.S., the New Interfaces for Musical Expression in the U.S., the New York City Electronic Music Festival, the Sound and Music Computing Conference in Cyprus, and at Spectrum in Berlin. Warren's music has been performed by ensembles such as Sartus, Dither, the Jack Quartet, Meehan Perkins Duo, So Percussion, and Yarn Wire. She's been teaching electronic music and multimedia as a visiting assistant professor at Brown University since earning her PhD in composition and computer technologies in 2017 from the University of Virginia.
Like filming my video right now.
Are you?
Should I be?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And audio.
I have a list of.
Hello.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi. I'm Elana. I am an undergrad at Brown. I study music and urban studies, but right now I'm taking I'm in the middle of a number of semesters off from school. Right now I'm doing some political work for the Working Families Party in New York, and I play trumpet, and Erik and I met in a class that he taught in the spring of my sophomore year, and I'm in a room with maps.
My name's Erik Deluca. I'm an artist, and I really like teaching.
Well, okay, I would love for you to like answer the question, what are we talking about? Like, however, like as a kind of broad springboard.
What are we talking about in the next 20 minutes?
Yeah.
We, together with 8 other people, spent about 5 months together. Like you mentioned, when was that? Fall 2020. And we made it's so hard to kind of talk about what we did in such a short like sentence. But I'll say that the title of today's talk and this essay that we wrote after that project is called Ears to the Ground, Public Art in Sound Listening and Collective Voice. And the thing that's most exciting to me about what we worked on back then and what we're continuing to work on is this is the last part of this title, Collective Voice. The course description that was advertised to the students, and I hate to use the word advertise, but I think when we were writing this, I used the word advertise, and you said maybe you should use the word publicized. So
The class that we were part of, I think it's, yeah. The class. Yeah. Maybe we should like take a side note here and just quickly say that
So there's this podcast called On Being, and on that podcast, John Lewis basically was asked about why he does what he does. And he responded by saying, when we were sitting in, it was love in action. When we went on the Freedom Ride, it was love in action. The march from Selma to Montgomery was love in action. We do it not simply because it's the right thing to do, but it's love in action.
we're facilitating like a
Oh,
course.
you're frozen. Wait, you froze. You froze. Not you froze. You froze.
Okay, wait. Am I back?
Am I back?
And one of the ways that we did that is through thinking about the projects not as something that will become complete, but that will be seeds for the future. So what did we say? We said that all of our projects are blueprints. So there's actually no such thing as a kind of final end result. And when you do that, you, me, us, the collective, and our collaborators are focusing on processes of learning instead of some kind of like object that we have as a result.
In reframing those as blueprints and reframing like what really was and continues to be the project, it like honestly really reminds me of something I've been thinking about right now in like organizing work.
Yeah. Tell people what you're doing now. I think it's important.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, right now what I'm doing is kind of like an internship with the Working Families Party of New York, which is an organization that works to like elect champions of working people, of Black, Indigenous people of color, but like which at the same time as they do electoral work is also working to build a movement to go along with it. And yeah, we could get into like why that has to like is related to there being a third party, but if we want to like actually get people elected and who will be good and like accountable people for us, then to do that well, we also need to be building power beyond each individual election cycle. And so that's like a reframing that I think also just like applies to organizing, that it's not about short-term like transactional kinds of like things that end. It's about building towards something much larger. So that's, I don't know, something I was thinking about. How do you think for you, or like also from what you've heard from other members of the collective, how do you think the project is resonating into what someone recently called this year as COVID 2020? And
Gosh, yeah. I mean, when we were working on this writing after the project in fall 2020, we were working on it basically at the height of both the COVID pandemic and also the kind of uptick in protest in relation to police brutality of Black Americans. I look back to that first interaction that we did. I mean, you play in the mariachi at Brown. I don't know if you still do, but
Yeah, we're out today.
What's that? You practiced today?
Yeah, we had our first meetup in months. It was great, but okay.
So we went to see you play at an event at the legislative offices in Rhode Island. You know, we went to the Capitol building, and there was a moment where, you know, the Star Spangled Banner was being sung, and then right after that, the Mexican national anthem was performed. And I feel like we were all in sort of disbelief at the stark differences between those two performances. On the one hand, the Star Spangled Banner was about this sort of, it was about this one person performing. And then the Mexican national anthem, everybody was dancing and together. And it created a kind of confusion, I think, for folks. And it was the first moment where we were thinking about disjuncture in the public sphere in relation to sound and listening. And somebody said, you know, it's important to sort of sit in the disjuncture. How do we explore, lean into it, and unpack it? Somebody said. And so I feel like we're all today dealing with disjuncture. And I don't think we have the option of not exploring it, leaning into it, and unpacking it. You know?
Yeah. Towards kinds of in-between spaces, and like being okay with failure. Yeah.
My camera stopped working.
Oh no.
Aww.
What do we do?
It's alright. Turn it back on. We'll just.
Yeah. I guess just like wanted to say in relation to like that moment that you were talking about of like collectively experiencing such disjuncture, it just makes me think about how this class generally, or the class and then the project, the class, yes, allowed us.
I should mention that there's a confusion here between the class and a project. And if you all are confused at home, that's okay, because we are also.
Yeah, but yes, the part of the project that was in the eyes of the university, the class, that class was probably like one of the only ones I've taken in spaces I've been in more broadly where like an emphasis on the in-between, and the messy is what it is, and like that is the point of it. That was like a really important, I think, part of the experience of this class, and the project more generally, like also in our writing process together, when we were creating this piece about what had happened. I think and like with this activity right now, I'm like, wow, like I don't know what's really gonna happen, and I don't know, like, yeah, and I think that, you know, as someone who's like conditioned into a lot of systems of capitalism and patriarchy and white supremacy, like I think that's hard. That's hard to be there.
Like right now, our conversation is kind of chaotic and malleable and it's moving, it's alive. But if we read this essay, I mean, these words are very fixed, and we spent a lot of time in crafting. We said, as an ongoing project, one that sits directly in the ambiguity of the spaces between art, life, cyborg, human, right, wrong, our moments of transition from one place to another have been especially textured. And so it's in one of those moments that we begin. And that moment was when we walked off the College Hill and went to the Capitol building for the first time and felt this kind of disjuncture through sound and listening.
Our mode of transport most often, which was a van that you, Erik, had, that you'd used for another project, and that we used to get from place to place. And there's a really cool paragraph in there kind of talking about the space that that van held for us to be in transition.
Can you read that? Because it's I don't know, it's connected to what we're talking about right now.
Yeah, totally.
It's on page 14.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The collective traveled from site to site in an old sky blue minivan that became an in-between place where we synthesized our collective voice. Appropriately driving back up College Hill after our last meeting with Community Music Works, a conversation emerged about the post-human position, which turned into the collective cheering over Donna Haraway, who famously wrote, "Cyborg imagery can suggest a way out of the maze of dualisms in which we have explained our bodies and our tools to ourselves. It means both building and destroying machines' identities, categories, relationships, and space stories. Cyborg thinking that rejects binary understandings of success has evolved in Providence both through the activity of Wendy Carlos, the Grammy Award-winning electronic music composer, Brown University alumnus 1962, and the Dirt Palace, a feminist nonprofit live-work arts space in a repurposed Olneyville library."
And I love
if you let the in-between spaces breathe and you let the connections get made in these spaces, these in-between spaces, I don't know, it's maybe it's the script. Also, in between spaces are, the anxiety. There were two forms of anxiety. One form was dealing with death. Going to a cemetery is difficult for some people. I think about death a lot, so it's not very difficult for me. And then, in terms of positionality, most of the white males in the class were nervous about going there because, who are they to go and work with a historian who loves humanizing these folks who were enslaved, that were buried there. And we kept on reminding them that this is about processes of learning. This is about processes of dialogue with Keith and with the love and action that he works on. And so if you frame it as a process of learning, then here it is. So we talk about the Warren Candors, and we're talking about the money that we got from, who knows, Warren Candors could have directly funded our project. And we wrote, and we were transparent about this with the group. We were very transparent about money. We wrote, it was important for the collective to use this institutional money to create a new reality. There's disjuncture in all these. There's disjuncture in the world. And I would like to. There's disjuncture in the world, and because of my position as a human being, I have been given the courage to find these places of disjuncture, to unpack them, as one of the collective members wrote, and to create a new reality, one that I believe in, that is ethical, that is about equity.
Because I think more and more, like, in my own, just, like, trying to, like, self-educate and stuff, about, like, what it is that we're really in and what we're really participating in, like, I think it's pretty clear, it becomes more and more clear how, like, institutions like the schools we're at, are kind of fundamentally not liberatory, and so the idea of having courage, to, like, take those things we're given and transform them, I think is a really helpful and hopeful framework for thinking about continuing to, like, you know, you're continuing to teach and I'm continuing to, like, eventually return to school and, like, be, like, in here, yeah, and to be okay with the disjuncture. I just, like, wanted to quickly, like, name a thing that I heard. I was listening to an interview with Claudia Rankine, who wrote, like, Citizen, and she talked about this poetry that she'd read, this line, and it said, like, do you have the courage, something like this, do you have the courage to bring a moment to its crisis? And I, like, heard that, like, 2 weeks ago, and just, like, I think that really speaks to, like, the in-between spaces that we're talking about, and also probably, like, John Lewis and Good Trouble, and yeah, I don't know.
So at the end of the essay, we ask the reader, where do we go from here? And this was a question, I think, for us in trying to think through ways of kind of ending the essay. But how would you answer that question now? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, like, we keep,
Way back in March, when the first version of this conference was supposed to take place, I was planning to either present a slightly reworked version of my dissertation research, which fits in nicely with the other papers presented in this panel about community-oriented sound work, or a discussion about disability and sound within video games, revived from an earlier publication I made on Sounding Out, the Sound Studies blog, or perhaps a nascent idea I'd been kicking around about Black sonorities and vocal distortion. But in many ways, it has become impossible for me to work and think outside of the moment in which we find ourselves. The reality is that I've not been able to think or write very much of anything. These ideas have continued to live in the back of my brain. So, instead, I hope you will permit me to read a piece I wrote over the summer that was largely informed by questions that emerged from my students and within myself through discussions in the feminist sound studies class that I taught in the spring. Reflecting on the criminal mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic and the pandemic of anti-Black racism and post-colonial destruction this summer has in many ways sharpened my gaze and my ability to listen to myself in the world. And I wanted to spend some time talking about the ways this transformation has taken place over time. Many of these realizations I made while sound walking around my community. The practice of moving through a space, often with a recording device in hand, with the intention to listen, as a way to both consider all that is being silenced and distorted across changing soundscapes, and as a reflection of the ways that listening practices are always bounded by our relationships to our race, gender, and class positionality. I have placed the sounds of my community in West Philly behind my voice. What do you hear when I speak? And now I begin. Just before quarantine began in mid-March, at the very last in-person meeting of the feminist sound studies class I was teaching at Brown, I showed my students the documentary film, What Happened, Miss Simone, about the complicated life of the High Priestess of Soul. Throughout the semester, we had been talking about the politics of documentation and archiving. We discussed Zora Neale Hurston and the radical import of her sonic autoethnographies of Black Southern life. We'd examine the unwieldy biography of the blues singer Estelle Mama Yancey as a way to recognize that we are all unreliable narrators, even in the construction of our own personal histories. And we talked about the ways in which Black artists are often compelled to use their creative work to document pain and suffering in ways that their white counterparts are not. By that last class, I had grown so proud that my students were applying Black feminist ideas to their understandings of the sounds of their everyday lives. In our follow-up discussion, which we held remotely 2 weeks later via Zoom, we delved into the details of Nina Simone's story. In particular, my students were deeply struck by the tension she experienced between emerging as a virtuosic pianist and songwriter who should have lived a completely charmed life and moving through the U.S. as a dark-skinned, big-lipped, big-nosed Black woman in the middle of the civil rights era. We ruminated on the ways in which the narratives of Black performers are so often hijacked by the demands of addressing systems of oppression like racism and misogynoir. Their God-given and hard-earned talents and gifts are routinely routed toward the cause of illuminating, responding to, and eradicating systemic oppression at the cost of their financial security, personal safety, interpersonal relationships, sanity, and physical health, their own creative and professional imperatives, and ultimately their lives. In the documentary, when asked about a letter she wrote to her parents regarding her first-of-its-kind appearance at Carnegie Hall in 1963, Miss Simone replied, quote, "Well, I loved the audience, but I wasn't playing classical music like I wanted to be. And so I wrote, yes, I am Carnegie Hall, finally, but I'm not playing Bach," end quote. In the wake of the Black Lives Matter uprisings that have erupted worldwide since Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin publicly murdered George Floyd on May 25th, I've revisited Miss Simone's lamentations almost every day. I'm a rapper and have been living and supporting myself as one over the better part of the past decade. Last year, I was hired to teach in the music department at an Ivy League university, in large part because of my music. I'm an artist that many would call, quote, political because I engage with the realities of social inequality in much of my work, although I would prefer the term politicized, a distinction that has been articulated eloquently by the painter Shabalala Self, who calls attention to the ways that systems of oppression fashion Black women like her as always already politicized subjects. I call myself a Black feminist, and I position myself accordingly through the cultural workers, intellectuals, organizers, and friends that I cite, teach, and support. And like Miss Simone, I am a dark-skinned Black woman existing in a civil rights era of her own. Now more than ever, I've begun to speculate about the personal cost of routing all my energies toward the cause of our collective liberation. I ask myself earnestly, could I die for this? Like, what does it really mean to be ready to die for something? What does it mean to die or be dead already? What am I ready to sacrifice for the greater good, for a future I likely won't ever see? As an artist, is my work enough, or am I hiding behind that work because giving up more would feel like one concession too many? Ultimately, is my art a form of activism? The realities of being an activist on the front lines are often grim. Anybody with even a rudimentary understanding of the, quote, people's history of the world knows this to be true. In a now deleted Instagram post from the brilliantly outspoken poet, rapper, and book club organizer No Name, she shared a stirring image of Angela Davis delivering a speech at Madison Square Garden with the caption, quote, "Angela Davis spoke behind a four-sided bulletproof glass shield at Madison Square Garden, 29 June 1972. So many of our revolutionaries have been murdered or are political prisoners serving 50-year sentences. Every day I'm grateful this woman is not only living but still fighting for us. Radical politics isn't a Halloween costume. Abolitionist, communist, heart emoji," end quote. This shit is real. People on the front lines lose their jobs, they lose their eyes, they become responsible for medical debt in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're imprisoned for years and sometimes decades. They have to cough up money for bail and money for legal counsel. They risk lifelong surveillance. They are surreptitiously hunted. They are disappeared. The real cost of fighting for justice in a society that jails and taxes us, and only us, for minor, quote, infractions at every turn is innumerable. I ask myself again, am I ready to serve a 50-year sentence for this shit? Ready to lose my job? I think about my employer-issued health insurance and the chronic respiratory issues that have sent me to the hospital more than once over the past few years. I think about the tear gas. Am I ready to lose my life for this shit? The question of what it means to be an activist looms so large for me in part because it is a term that has occasionally been attached to my person by virtue of my sonic work and research. It does not feel earned. I wonder if I might one day step into the responsibility of that role. I am reminded of the introduction to Necessary Noise by Dr. Seri Ndalico, in which she teases apart different registers of the term activism by examining 3 rhetorical tactics used by filmmakers in the east of Congo who are seeking to successfully bring their social justice-oriented projects to life: engagement, activism, and militantism. Citing Mweze Ngangura, a pioneer of Congolese cinema, she notes, quote, "Engagement refers more to the practice of filmmakers making films about social or political issues. Such films are generally commissioned by an NGO or other entity and generally defined or prescribe solutions to a specific problem such as illiteracy, hygiene, or voting rights. Activism is generally positioned as more radical than engagement because it is linked with progressive ideology rather than being directly associated with monetary compensation. Many activists undertake campaigns, whether cinematic, musical, political, etc., without any promise of payment, simply because they're concerned about an issue and feel compelled to catalyze change. When successful, such projects or campaigns often become targets of collaboration on the part of NGOs, which are positioned to introduce money and power into movements that started at the grassroots level. Equally common are activist initiatives that directly seek the sponsorship of a powerful entity through which they have a larger platform to make a given point, but which sometimes require certain compromises to qualify for funding. I have come to the understanding that militantism is more radical still because it is a stance that refuses ideological compromise at all costs. Although these categories are, of course, not to be understood as stable identities, which Deluca herself notes, at the heart of distinguishing different forms of activist art projects is the recognition that the stakes of doing good are vastly different depending on the rhetorical and practical strategies employed by the do-gooder in question. I think about the folks who I spoke to and read about while researching my dissertation on community-based studios. In particular, I'm reminded of Inclusive Recording, a feminist community studio in Pittsburgh that I visited between 2018 and 2019. I think about my conversations with Claire, who owned the space, in which he discussed how inclusive recording was designed as a way to completely eschew norms around expertise and exclusion that were pervasive in sound engineering culture. I think about how she framed herself as a facilitator and her space as one that engenders the deconstruction of boundaries around technical knowledge, which allowed her to thumb her nose at the power dynamics that had characterized her initiation into sound engineering cultures. Like many of the engineers I interviewed for the project and those whose experiences have been carefully documented in other studio ethnographies, Claire received her initial in-studio training through an internship in an environment where it was best to be seen and not heard. At Inclusive Recording, Claire could present the possibility of a more generous transmission of knowledge, technical knowledge, as well as what it might look like for underserved communities to contribute their own forms of expertise and to even redefine the bounds of what constitutes technical knowledge. Whether in a skill share or in a recording session, Claire embodied her role as a facilitator, approaching interactions and others as conversations, with others as conversations rather than lectures or explanations. Viewed through this lens, asking questions or expressing confusion about a concept becomes a technical contribution because it prompts an opening of the black boxes that populate the workspace of more seasoned engineers. Reflecting on her positive experiences leading skill shares, Claire remarked, quote, "Every time I've done a skill share, I've learned something, or someone has asked a question that's made me restructure the way that I'm thinking about one of my processes. I'm also getting a lot out of it," end quote. In this way, the educational obligations of spaces like Inclusive Recording enabled a more expansive understanding of the technical work performed even by novice recording artists in their interactions with sound engineers. But the fact remained that even for Claire, sitting in front of the computer, endowed with greater knowledge than her clients about how it all works, she was a white woman with an advanced degree who carried her own technical and artistic preferences that are shaped by these backgrounds and by her knowledge. I thought about the safety of her life outside of the studio. Some people's version of doing good allows them to remain financially, socially, and legally protected, while for others, doing good marks them as dead people walking. As I begin to make sense of my own work, I then ask, how high are the stakes really when I write and perform a song about my experience of the world? When I show up in a classroom? When I show up in a studio? The reality is that I have long felt uncomfortable with living in this activist-adjacent space, mostly because I'm not able to distill what activism means and should look like depending on one's proximity to privilege and power. I grew up middle-class-ish. We didn't talk about money. The child of 2 immigrant parents who came to the States from Cote d'Ivoire and the Democratic Republic of Congo in the 70s to earn their PhDs and work their way up to teaching at prestigious colleges. Most of my young life, I shared a room with one or both of my brothers in modest apartments, while all of my mostly white friends lived in houses. By the time I was in college, we had a whole house too. At 34 years old, I think I'm doing okay. I live in a pretty spacious one-bedroom apartment with my husband that we can comfortably afford. We have some debt and some savings. Our car is a piece of shit, but we do not have to worry about where our next meal is coming from. I'm also a dark-skinned bi Black woman who has worked tirelessly to create a sustainable music career in the male-dominated, deeply colorist, and often queer antagonistic space of hip-hop, and the oppressively white and male universes of gaming. I am one of few Black students to have ever come out of the Science and Technology Studies department at Cornell University with a PhD. And I am one of two Black tenure-track faculty members in the music department at Brown. Both myself and my colleague, the brilliant Dr. Charisse Barron, were just hired over the past 2 years. What should my activism look like? On good days, I can see the value in the art I have created, mostly because of messages from supporters who remind me that what I do matters. And on my best days, I can even recognize the important work that my existence in academic spaces is doing. In my short time at Brown, I've had young women and Black and brown students express their excitement that I'm in the department through drop-ins to my office hours and via cold emails. And there are ways in which I feel like I am making real changes. During my first semester, I convinced a young woman of color to stay in my rap songwriting class after she expressed reservations about the technological requirements of the course. Throughout my time as a graduate student and now as a postdoctoral fellow, I have organized and will continue to devise programs, panels, and performances to funnel university funds to the brilliant Black creatives that I've met in my life as a working musician. These moments feel like concrete expressions of my power. I don't know that this is activism, but it is something. Should I have to name it at all? I am angered at the thought. I found it outrageous that I should have to commit any time and energy dismantling systems that me and my ancestors didn't have a hand in creating. Systems that have thrived because of their centuries-long subjugation and oppression of my people. I feel the crushing weight of these systems in my own family history. My great-uncle Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected prime minister of the Congo and an international symbol of resistance for people engaged in post-colonial liberation struggles, was assassinated by the CIA in 1961 because he dared to push back against the corrupting influence of Belgium and the US. I'm frustrated that instead of having the luxury to commit my brain to literally anything else besides harm reduction and survival, I'm instead compelled to think only and always of what I am not doing. I feel guilty when I make space for other things. I feel guilty that I now work at a mostly white, very rich Ivy League institution. I am also relieved by the presence of my guilt and my desires to do more, to extend my hands further into myself and my community, and to gently push back against my long-standing belief that just being a dark-skinned Black woman existing in this airspace is enough. The friction reminds me that I am alive. As I come to terms with the fact that I may never know peace, I am also acknowledging that one way or the other, these demons called racism, sexism, and capitalism have been trying to kill me all along, even as I have tried my hardest not to be killed. I am recognizing more and more that framing my anxieties about doing, quote, enough, in terms of whether I'm ready to die for this shit, is a moot point. Death comes for me in other ways. It manifests in the slow death that characterizes Black women's astronomical morbidity rates related to the stress of survival, or their deaths from broken hearts that come from managing the endless losses and mass graves littered with the bodies of our people. It manifests in the unconscionable murder rate and median age of death for Black trans women. It manifests in the all-consuming yet preventable respiratory issues I deal with now because my doctors didn't listen to me 12 years ago when I told them repeatedly that my cold was not just a cold. It manifests in my palpable fears of dying in childbirth, a fate that meets Black women at a 243% higher rate than white women, regardless of socioeconomic status. It manifested in Miss Simone's lamentation that she would never be able to just show the fuck out as a classical pianist without being endlessly politicized. The fact of just living in this world as a Black woman cares not how, quote, ready we are to be sacrificed. Ready or not, we are dying. And so, even if just to finally get some rest for the night, I slowly start to spin the question on its head. I ask, am I ready to live for this shit? Am I ready to try and peek beyond my fear that I am not doing enough and can never do enough? To wrestle with the fact that I alone will never undo this tangled, thorny mass of pain, lies, greed, disease, and suffering that threatens to suffocate us all daily. So long as I work at Brown and collect my paycheck, I know I am complicit in its survival. Yet by waking up every day, showing up and trying, I am also an aberration and a portal through which small but necessary change can come for those I care about and maybe even those down the line I'll never meet. What I am committed to now is crafting my capacity and readiness to show up so I may do that work. I want to be alive in both theory and practice. I'm trying to develop the reflexes to respond to this world with my fullest self by first engaging deeply with my own worst fears. I start by writing this piece, then by reading my work out loud, and in doing that, reading myself out loud. As I instructed my students to do with the brilliant thinkers we engaged last semester, I'm celebrating all of the different ways that we Black women can be made alive on this planet. In my case, as a sometimes rapper, beatmaker, educator, daughter, wife, sister, friend, neighbor, gamer, feminist, and citizen. Through my archives of interdependence, paper trails of texts, tweets, emails, syllabi, show flyers and receipts, shared memories of community meetings, marches, way too late dinner parties, vacations, voice memos, and dirty-ass DIY shows, and yes, all of the selfies. I am breathing life into this Black woman body that was delivered to this planet already a cadaver. All these things are proof that I am alive. I am writing this piece to warm myself to the idea that I should also bring these things into every space I enter, no matter the discomfort to others and to myself. And all while knowing that even when it feels like I'm doing the most, I still won't be doing enough. And with that acknowledgement, I begin to move from inadvertently writing out my will to live, or writing out my will to singing out my will to live. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, and I just want to say thank you first to Ed Osborne for inviting me to be part of today and all of these exciting presentations. I'm Stefan Moore, and the name of my talk is Transforming Urban Noise. And today I'm going to be talking about really two different things that all add up to ideas about transforming urban noise. And what I mean by that is instead of having to think about noise in our cities as something that we have to deal with head on, where we should be inventing new technologies and doing everything we can to reduce the amount of noise pollution that exists, it takes more of an approach of that. While that may be a valuable long-term goal, in the short term, we're not going to get rid of noise in cities. And so there may be other interesting ways to think about leveraging that noise or working with that noise to be able to create sound experiences that are more interesting to live with. And for me as an artist, I've always had a very ambivalent attitude towards urban noise, machine noise, mechanical noise, traffic noise, and that I find these sounds to be tiring sometimes and troublesome sometimes and overwhelming sometimes. But also I find them to have a weird kind of inner beauty and complexity that I guess probably sets me apart in some ways from some of the folks who as acoustic ecology proponents see them as kind of an unequivocally bad thing. So I want to talk about one project first and then go into another project that's more recent. Starting with this project here that was led by the Australian sound artist, scholar, and primary investigator for this project, Jordan Lacey, called Soundscape Design of Motorway Parkland Environments, Cancellation, Transformation, and Ethnography. This was a large project that was funded by a company called Transurban. They're a company that builds and maintains tollways in a lot of Australian cities, and also one tollway in Washington, D.C., it turns out. And they had an Innovation Fund grant that they awarded to Jordan to work on his proposal, which was to figure out a way to redesign and think in different ways about the sort of small amounts of parkland that are created in a city when a tollway cuts through. Usually these are spoke roads that connect the ring roads that form around cities. Jordan's original ideas were published in this book in 2016, Sonic Rupture, a practice-led approach to urban soundscape design. And this quote I pulled out it just sort of talks about Jordan's attitude towards dealing with governments and corporations in this context. He says there's no reason to assume that developers and governments would not welcome changes to their own practices. The challenge for us as creative practitioners is to convince them on how our efforts can augment their own. And so that's exactly what this project sought to do. And I'll skip ahead to the end of it here real quick and just show this is the first page of the 72-page report that was published as the result of our work. Transurban awarded an innovation grant to RMIT University, which is where Jordan is currently working, to undertake research into managing motorway noise using active noise cancellation and transformation. More on the active noise cancellation in a minute. The research completed by RMIT was the first international example of applying noise transformation using live electroacoustic technology in noise-affected environments to improve community perception of urban noise. I thought it was crazy and kind of amazing that they chose to take this research project on. I was really excited to be a part of it. So here is Jordan and Lawrence Harvey, who is one of the other investigators on this project, looking at various of these parklands. We ended up choosing two sites, one in Melbourne and one in Sydney, that we worked at. One was in, one part of the project was in 2016 where we did a lot of tests in a lab. And then in 2017, we went out and did these on-site tests. This is the research team we were working with. The leads here are Jordan and Lawrence, and then Sarah Pink, who's a really well-known ethnographer, who was brought in to work with the community, kind of independent from our team, and talk to them about the effect of traffic noise on their lives living close to these highways. And then also to talk with people during and after the experience of some of the work we created to get a sense of how these things that we were trying out were being perceived by the community. And it was great to have that additional team. Also, Dr. Xiaozhen Chu, who is an acoustician and was working on the noise cancellation portion of the project, which I'll just mention very briefly. The idea was to use noise cancellation in the same way we think of noise canceling headphones, to produce a phase shifted wave that would counteract the sound coming in from the highway. I was really curious when this part of the team came on board to see if they would be able to do anything in the really sort of complex sound field that comes in from all directions that's created with noise along the highway. And in short, they weren't really able to do anything perceivable, although they did get some measurable results that the ear didn't really allow us to hear. So this was the cancellation side of the project, and their results are also written up. But the transformation part of the project here, we had basically just a computer and a 4-channel quad sound system placed in these park areas. And this looks like it's a big park, but well, some of these pictures are from Sydney and some are from Melbourne. But in each case, you have about 50 to 75 feet from where the sound wall along the highway is to where houses begin. And we're set up in that little dead zone there, which is ostensibly a park, but because of the noise quotient there, you hardly ever see anyone in the park. So we set up our equipment, and this is the desk I got to sit at and work in for a week at a time in each location. I had microphones up over the sound wall listening to the highway, and then I was taking that sound in and trying a number of different approaches to interpreting, translating, processing, filtering that sound to try and get a sense of it, of how it could be transformed or how we could create sound to go alongside it. I learned a few really interesting things. I learned that during rush hour, when traffic slows down, if the average speed of the traffic falls below 35 miles an hour, we listen to the engines of the cars because and the trucks, because that's the most audible portion. And if we're looking at something where a time when the cars are moving faster, then the sound of the tires picks up, and it's much more high pitched. It's much more broad spectrum. And so the algorithms I was making had to take into account sort of low traffic times, busy traffic times, and also factors like rain that will really sonically transform the profile of the sound. We did have quite a bit of rain during these weeks, which is why I'm under this tent in these pictures. I'm going to skip through the ethnography part of this, although their results were really interesting, and they're also written up in the paper. And yeah, like I said, they were great to have as part of the team. I just don't have time to go into their stuff today. But this is the listening party that sort of happened at the end. The full team is there. A number of transurban executives are there. Members of the community are there, and we're all kind of listening to the results of the project. And I thought I would just very quickly try and share with you a little bit of what that sounded like. It's hard over headphones, but I'm going to try the Zoom high quality stereo sound and see if what I'm able to get across here works. So this is the sound of the traffic itself. I have sort of a 20-minute loop of traffic recordings here that I'm working with. And I'm going to mute myself, and I'm going to bring in some of these transformations. I'll also sometimes duck out the traffic so you can hear the transformation without the traffic sound. The desire in each of these situations, in each of these transformations I showed, was not to obliterate the sound or eliminate the sound of the traffic noise, but it was to try to create something that seemed to live inside the traffic noise, that made it more interesting, that added more sounds to it, more layers of sound to it, more nuance to it, more interest to it, so that it would be a better listening experience. And we discovered that if we kind of kept the decibel level about 1 to 3 decibels under the traffic sound, that was the sweet spot for us in terms of being able to transform the sound without creating a new form of noise pollution ourselves or forcing people to listen exclusively to this noise that was masking everything else out. In the first instance, I was filtering the sound, applying resonant filters to it to sort of create these long tones. And in the second example, I'm just straight up doing pitch detection off of a specially filtered version of that traffic noise, and then triggering synthesized sort of square waves being put through reverb to try and accompany or create something that would kind of extract the musical qualities from the traffic noise and then represent them. And that's about as much as I want to say about that project. And I want to go on to talking now about a project that I did just as we were wrapping up the last papers from that previous project. This opportunity came up. The curators Sam Pluta and Laura Stewart at the University of Chicago put together an exhibition of 9 sound artists on the campus of the University of Chicago, and commissioned the 9 of us to create pieces. And we went on walks throughout the campus to try and figure out where our individual sites would be. This is the sign for the piece I ended up creating called 6 Accompaniments for Solo Voice. And the solo voice I'm referencing here is the sound of the HVAC system that lived atop the Cyril Chemistry Lab, which is there kind of in the lower left. This area of the campus is part of the larger quad, but it's kind of sequestered. It's called the Snail Hitchcock Quad. And this quad, as you can see, it has this amazing sort of ring of benches, 6 benches, that all seem as though they're facing the chemistry building. And so my conceit was that they were all kind of, sitting you there to listen to the sound coming from the HVAC building, which is really the only reason, or the only sound that you can hear with any clarity in that space. It's really actually hard to be in this part of the quad, even though it's nicely landscaped and it's very comfortable physically. Sound-wise, it's very difficult to enjoy being in a space, and it's usually fairly deserted. So this seemed like a good idea, or a good place to test out some of the ideas that had come out of this previous research. And I'm just going to read from some portions of my artist statement around that. The experience there was in my mind, or the experience in Australia was in my mind as I toured the University of Chicago's campus to choose a site for a future installation. The Snail Hitchcock Quadrangle is dominated by a sonic blight similar in some ways to that of the highway side parks I worked on. The din of the endless exhalation coming from the air handling systems on top of the chemistry building is such that it's difficult to spend time in the quad without headphones or some other means of sonic distraction. The difference is that this air handling sound, while rich and composed of numerous layered pulses and drones, is constant and persistent, whereas the traffic sounds were quite variable. And that opened up the possibility of doing something that was pre-recorded and not dynamic. I was able to visit this site over the course of an entire year at all times of day, make recordings, and to notice that the sound from the building had no appreciable change, and presumably wouldn't unless mechanically parts of it started to fail. So this is what it looks like from one of those benches. You see this really weirdly glass encased, but only partially, and there's slats between the glass. I don't know if they were trying to do a sound baffle or if it was just a way of not making you look at the sort of ugliest parts of it. But it doesn't do anything to stop the sound. Here's the sound from the bench.
This is from the courtyard facing up towards the building.
And you can hear all the layers of sound that are going on in there. This is the Google Maps top view of the building. I actually did get them to let me go up on top of the building, and it's actually while I was up there that it occurred to me that these benches would be really the right spot to work in, kind of looking through these glass slats outward. I was encouraged to attempt a similar approach to creating accompaniments to the sound when I noticed the quarter circle walkway in the quad, along which 6 park benches had been stationed. These benches all faced the chemistry building as though waiting for an audience that would come to hear the building sing. And they presented an opportunity to attempt 6 different approaches to quietly accompanying the voice of the building. Some shots from up on top of the building, which are kind of amazing. Here's a field recording. You can see my field recording gear sitting there on the ledge. loud. Yeah, so I'll just read the rest of what I have here, and then I'll wrap up. Recordings were made of the ventilation noise up close, on the roof, amid the machines, and from the ground below. But in making all these recordings, I was unable to recreate the accompaniments, or to create these accompaniments for the first time at my home studio. I found that even though I could do pitch extraction and analysis from my studio, I wasn't at all able to bring myself to actually write music in that space, so far from the experience of being outdoors and being in this site. My experience of being on the bench was always completely different from anything that I could represent in a recording. So I found that I needed to compose with my laptop while sitting on each bench, hearing the way the quad's acoustics emphasize different parts of that massive composite noise, depending on my location. As I listened, the sound began to share its secrets. Multiple chords, each with their own tuning system, became apparent. Some of these sounds cycled through louder and softer states on a slow rotation, while others followed intricate rhythms that could only be heard from certain angles. I saw my task as designing new sounds that would draw these stunning details through the noise's dull exterior and bring them to a listener's attention. In other words, an accompaniment that allows us to listen through the accompaniment and to isolate and bring out certain features of the overall sound. Yeah, some other shots. This is later in the installation. This must have been December when I was doing these photos. Having composed these 6 accompaniments now, and I guess in conclusion, my attitude towards the noise has become one of energized and engaged ambivalence. The noise is definitely pollution. It's unhealthy and the product of indifferent design and our peculiar pervasive cultural deafness that allows us to create such monstrosities and to let them sit out in the open. But at the same time, it is a vital complex of fascinating musical structures. Its Baroque anatomy reflects the workings of multiple systems that cooperate to produce it. It's a big instrument. Its presence is evidence of the difficulty, effort, and care that have been taken to ensure the safety of the people working in the chemistry building and the success of their activities. So this is where the ambivalence comes from. So I don't know whether that sound is truly necessary or whether we could architecturally design it out of there, design around it. But I'm sure that that sound, as it stands, will continue long after the conclusion of the exhibition. And here we are a year out and it's still there. And most likely beyond the presence of any of the students who are currently working in that lab, maybe beyond the tenure of any of the professors who are working in that lab. Therefore, as a kind of lasting yet immaterial monument, the sound deserves consideration. And I think with this piece, what I was trying to say is that we should ask ourselves and continue to ask the questions that are too seldom posed about how we value our communal spaces and how we choose the phenomena we invite into our daily life. I invite you to join in the ambivalence I feel towards this sound by experiencing this piece. And as a footnote, I went through a lot of processes trying to document this piece and ended up coming up with a field recording where I could walk slowly between each of the benches and dip into and out of their particular sound worlds. I took this field recording and then stretched the concept one idea further and had a moment once you get into the world of a particular bench where the field recording fades out and the recording of the underlying sound fades in for a moment and you get to hear it without context, and then the context quickly closes back in. This album was just released last month. It's called Dream Walk with Solo Voice, and I think I'm over time. Otherwise, I would play some of it for you right now. But I can bring it up for you and show you. This is the page on Bandcamp, and I will post this as a link. I encourage you to go check it out. You can hear the whole thing for free on Bandcamp, streaming there. So I'll conclude my talk there. Thank you for your time, and I will look forward to talking with you at the conclusion of this session. Hello, good morning, and
welcome everyone. My name is Christina Warren. I'm going to be moderating the panel discussion that's happening now. While our panelists come online with audio and video, I'll say a few intros and thank yous. Thanks to Ed Osborne for making this wonderful event possible. Thank you to the Brown Arts Initiative and the Music Department for facilitating, and thank you, Sean, for running tech this morning. I'd also like to do a land acknowledgement, and this is a little bit weird as we're geographically dispersed, but I'm going to do this for Brown, and I'm in Providence, and many of us are. We acknowledge that we are on the occupied territory of the Wampanoag and Narragansett peoples, who are the traditional stewards of this land. All right, so I'd like to welcome Erik, Elana, Enongo, and Stephan. Thank you all so much for your wonderful papers. Such a richness of ideas. I really thoroughly enjoyed listening and even attempting to wrap my head around all these things. But I'd like to welcome you all. Nice to see your faces distantly. And I'd like to start by asking you, how are you doing? And what is grounding your sound practice these days?
One of us has to start, right? I'm doing all right. I think I wake up in the morning feeling defeated, feeling like this election is eating my brain, feeling like all the stuff that's been happening this year is eating my brain. And then I go teach a class and I feel like my students knock some sense back into me and pick me up and remind me of what I can do that's useful. And so I kind of really dreaded teaching in this time, and it's still, I'm not gonna say that it's like awesome, because it's not, but my students have shown so much resilience and so much willingness to be flexible, and they show up with such energy and excitement about learning stuff that I think they're legitimately, like, on a day-to-day basis making me a better person and making me more capable of dealing with the time right now. So that's a big part of it. In terms of my own listening practice, I'm normally somebody who does a lot of field recording and does a lot of sound walking and does a lot of being outside, and being in a city like Chicago, it's not always, and especially where we've shut down the lakeshore, we've shut down a lot of the portions of the city where I might normally go to get outside in this kind of a situation. Weirdly, my listening practice has been finally catching up with 20 plus years of sounds I've squirreled away on hard drives and have never really taken the time to get through, and finally really going back through and giving a lot of my own archive of mainly of field recordings, or just of whatever random sounds I've collected, giving them a consideration I haven't been able to before. And that's been an entire emotional roller coaster, as it is whenever you revisit all the parts of your life. But yeah, I feel like I've gone on a whole journey remembering who I was and what I was thinking, what I was interested in at all those times when I made those recordings, and how that's reflected in what I'm doing. And that's been, I'll stop short of saying it's like healthy, but it's been fascinating. Anyway, that's my answer. Thanks for that question.
Hi. I was having like a stare down with Erik, like, is he gonna press it or am I gonna? But thank you for that, Stefan. I think I'm in a similar place. In terms of how I'm doing, I think right now I'm coming up for air. I think I'm realizing that I haven't, like I'm not on the other side, but I think through teaching and through having to kind of regularly engage with folks in a way that I wasn't over the summer, as I think was evidenced in my piece. I'm realizing that, okay, I kind of have needed that. I've needed to engage with, in particular, the students have been so thoughtful and have allowed me to think differently about the Zoom space, like what's possible within Zoom. Because I think I had come into the semester kind of obstinate, like, oh, you know, what can we do with this thing? And the class that I'm co-teaching with Kim Moore, who's wonderful, brilliant, she did this exercise on the first day where she said, pretend I have a ball in my hand and I'm going to throw it to you. And she went like that. And I caught it in my screen. And there was something about that shattered the space. Like it made me feel like we were in the same room. And suddenly Zoom kind of opened up to me as a space of possibility and not a space of constraint only. So I think being in a teaching environment and having to wrestle with Zoom and see what's possible with this thing is kind of where I'm at right now as far as my listening practice. And one of my friends just had a show recently that was live streamed, and he released a record, and I've kind of been following his trajectory to see how he's been. His name is Open Mike Eagle. I can put a link for his work in the chat, but what it means to release music at a moment like this, like where does it go, right? I think is something that I've been stressing a lot about, and which has been holding me back from writing. But I think now I'm in a place where it's fine if it just lives in my room. That's okay for it to live there as well too. So doing okay, I think.
Elana? Elana. So I'll just say something quick. At the end of our talk or conversation, the one between Elana and I said, where do we go from here? And Elana goes, and then it cuts to black. And this didn't occur to me until now, but an is a, I forget the correct name, but it's a thinking, you're sounding out thinking in a way. And that's kind of what's getting me through, doing a lot of yeah, you're showing people that I'm listening to them. Elana, do you want to add?
Yeah, it's funny because I was going to say that the thing that's like, one thing that's grounding my sound and listening practice right now is actually, I've been sending like voice memos back and forth every day to someone that I worked with earlier this year. Now she's in like North Carolina and I'm in Providence, and we were like running buddies and we did planking together. And so now we send a voice memo to each other every time we're like holding our plank form to try and like be like doing that well or whatever. And I noticed that like a lot of the time I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't hold this like physical like constraint anymore. And so I'll be like saying like things to Ashley, like, and then I did this or like whatever, monologuing. And then like at the end, I'm just like, and I think that's a way that is resonating in some of my like sound and listening and dialogue practices right now.
Elana, now we've framed every that comes out of your mouth as this poetic symbol for how to listen and be in the world.
You set it up perfectly. This transitions well. My next point is about attention, I think. Sarah Nicole England, writing about Indigenous Canadian sound art, describes attentiveness as an Indigenous mode of relating to sound. And she theorizes attentiveness to noise as a mode of actively engaging with the sonic detritus of white settler capitalism in order to decolonize and desettle. In what I think is a discursively similar move, Ali Martin, whom Enongo references, who is writing about sound walking as a Black woman in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods in DC, among other spaces, Martin writes, "As I continue to walk, be it through the unfamiliarity of Mississippi or my hometown DC, I do so with the reassurance that what I hear is enough." So I'm curious, what do y'all think or hope happens when you hear attentively? What's the importance of this act for you?
I'll jump in again to start, I guess. Yeah. That question is always, for me, is really tied up in thoughts about deep listening. To me, deep listening and attentiveness are a very similar practice. And those of you who know me know that I've one of my mentors back when I was getting my master's degree, I had a wonderful few years of working with Pauline Oliveros directly and learning from her about a deep listening. And I feel like you could ask her that question on 100 different days and get 100 different wonderful answers that would all feel pretty correct. The one that I feel like always resonated most strongly with me were the ones where she was talking about listening as a way of kind of provoking oneself to action. Strangely, that listening was anything but passive. That kind of attentiveness was anything but passive, and that the kind of action that would come out of it would be responsive, creative, improvisatory, and would it's almost as though your spirit is leaping forward and saying yes, and it's kind of yes anding the universe and whatever it's bringing to you, and to, in that listening, always be kind of redrawing the frame of your listening larger and larger. Are you including the sounds that your own thoughts are making? Are you including the background noise? Are you listening to the things that your habitual attention has sort of encouraging you not to listen to encourage to classify as noise instead of signal, and that, especially that boundary, that threshold between the not just the signal and the noise, but the real and the imaginary, was one that she was very careful to be inclusive across. If you're hearing it, or you think you're hearing it, or you think you should be hearing it, or it's absent, but you feel its absence, or you hear its absence, like all of those things are also things you're hearing. And to draw that there's as large a circle as possible around everything that you're experiencing, and then finding ways to play in that field, and to engage with it playfully. I think that's always, when I'm engaging with that kind of attention, that's what I'm trying to do, is to find the playful place.
Yeah, and I thank you for that. I think it's kind of along the lines of what you were talking about. For me, it's about making a commitment to a place, or making a commitment to a specific kind of sonic environment, which is you know, in many ways, really fraught and really difficult to do. I think as just a person existing in the world at this particular moment, but in particular, you know, as a Black woman who's the influx of noise from all of these different directions is really hard to commit to a particular moment or a space. So I think there's something really radical about making that commitment. And I think something that Erik and Elana were talking about was sort of like the process of learning. And I think when you're making that commitment, you're committing yourself to a process, and it's not about the end point, right? It's like the I think, like you were talking about, like the field kind of growing, sitting there and allowing the listening to take precedence over what you're supposed to hear, or like what this practice is for. So in my mind, I think that's, you know, I don't know if it's too like hokey to say, or maybe idealistic, but I do think awakening that in a person is enough to, you know, begin a revolution. If enough people are committed to a particular space, or committed to a moment, committed to listening, then it reverberates. I've been reading Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown for one of the classes that I'm teaching. And so she talks a lot about this with fractals and kind of this these waves of movement. And so I'm trying to commit to that idea that if I can really sit in a space and not think about the outcome, really listen to, as was demonstrated in the sound walk, you know, just be present, that's radical and can have transformative effects for not just myself, but the community.
Yeah, really resonating with that, Enongo. I like originally when Kristina asked this question, I was just thinking a lot about how in the process of writing the essay with Erik, there was like this moment, where I realized that like activism or organizing and like public sound art practices are like super related, and that like listening is like all also like all like part of like maybe one kind of like larger thing about just so well, I guess for example, like Stefan, you were talking about like when we're listening, there's like what's real and then like what's imagined, and like taking that all to be what we hear. And I think that in a lot of ways, like organizing towards like a vision of like a world that we want to build is like also about like hearing like in collaboration, like we're like building like coalitions of people who like because we hear each other and think about the things we want to like build together. And like that's like what like organizing and activism is about, is like hearing what we're imagining and what others are imagining, and like dialoguing with that. So
and I'll just add, I've been reading this Hungry Listening book that you're riffing with here. And, you know, settler colonialism is about power and taking control over one's environment. And to contrast that, and of course, everybody can sort of make the connections between this reach for power in their own sound practice and how they define noise and silence within that reach through the sort of inner colonialist that lives in some of us. One of the works that was kind of defining for Elana and I in the way that we facilitated the collective and the collective voice was a work by Rebecca Bellmore, who was an Ojibwe artist, who in the 90s made a work called Speaking to Their Mother, where she constructed this massive megaphone. Many know this work. They constructed this massive megaphone and brought it around to different areas that were affected by the Oka crisis in the 90s, where all this clear cutting was happening. And the megaphone was positioned on indigenous land to give indigenous people the opportunity to speak to the land. And through that action, resulted in a collective listening. And I like to contrast that kind of collective listening with a kind of colonialist listening, which is about power and taking control of one's own environment.
I'd like to kind of continue spinning out these topics. I'm seeing a sort of troubled relationship between complicity and activism. In your papers, you all address complicity in some way with universities, with weapons developers, with tollway builders, and so on. On the other hand, we have Fred Moten and Stefan Harney who flipped the notion of complicity to speak of the connectedness among people who are working to resist or subvert. And then we can look to Kameayewa, who performs as Moore Mother, sound poet, synthesist, recordist, musician, but who resists being labeled an activist. She says, why is it activist to care? Sonically care in my music. So, and she said in interviews, there was one from Moogfest a few years back where she can sometimes get frustrated if the audience is talking too much, if she hears them during her sets, and she'll really crank the volume because she considers her sound important to be put out into the universe in some way, which maybe also sits in a weird way with complicity as far as our conventional understandings of how we relate to audience and listeners as sound artists. So just as an open-ended thought, what are you thinking as far as complicity, activism, the ambivalence in these areas?
I really appreciate, I think, how you're framing this, that there's different ways to think about complicity. I recently, oh my gosh, my brain isn't working, but I read a book and I wrote a review of this book, which is why it's really upsetting that I can't remember the name of the author. But
it's cool. I do that all the time.
Mark Katz has written a book about hip hop diplomacy, and I think I saw Damien in the audience. Hi, Damien. He's the one who invited me on to write a review of this text. And in the book, which kind of unpacks the histories of Black musicians in the U.S. Being deployed to do kind of diplomatic work in different spaces and being kind of envoys, cultural envoys, to frame the U.S. as this kind of progressive space, or to try to, have people think positively about their relationship with the U.S. He talks a lot about complicity and the artists who are a part of that kind of complex, because many of them have, been the recipients of kind of U.S. imperialism. They have been affected by, even within the States, a number of the artists are Black queer women, for example, who have been sort of triply how the U.S. sort of treats its own citizens. And so they grapple so much with this idea of how can I then go to another country and with it sort of wear the banner of the U.S. On my back. And so that, I think that is sort of the space that I find myself in as well with grappling with this complicity. But I mentioned in my talk that I think naming that is important, that for me is proof that I'm alive. And it's proof for me that I'm not still in this place, that there is a movement, something that I'm wrestling with and trying to reconcile. So I think naming the kind of complicity is a huge, naming it, saying it out loud, writing it, speaking it, and continuing to revisit it through our work, being really reflexive about it is huge. I don't think it's just like a kind of flapping your gums or just making, I think that naming it is actually hugely important for me to remember why I do the work that I do, or think about what I'm trying to accomplish as far as getting the people that I know, the Black folks that I know, the artists that I know, providing them potentially with
with money, with access, with other things that I am in a position to provide. So I think always revisiting the question of complicity is huge. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
And I'll just add, and then maybe Elana and I can riff here, but you know, there's John Lewis said often, if you see something, say something. And I feel like in our project, we really took that to heart in so many different realms and zones, both in the way that we were transparent to each other and in the ways that we were transparent with our collaborators and the ways in which we were transparent with our positionality in relation to the environment, in the environments that we were situated in and their conditions.
I think there are some points I brought up, sort of thinking about the complicity of the work in the paper that I could just sort of, or in my talk, that I could just sort of reemphasize. For the Australian urban motorway noise transformation work, that, you know, as I acknowledged, that was all being funded by essentially the entity that was had built and was managing the motorway. And I think that we definitely, from the acoustic ecology scene, Jordan and I have kind of a long running conversation about this. I used to be very involved in the acoustic ecology organization here in the US, and he used to be very involved in it in Australia. We both over time have kind of withdrawn from those communities because they seem to have a very rigid view of you know, anything you do that doesn't completely condemn the sources of noise in our cities is sort of traitorous to the cause. And I think that well, in both halves of what I was saying, that to me, I do harbor a kind of, down to the spiritual level, kind of an ambivalence about all of this. I feel like those sounds are sounds that I have a certain familiarity with and fondness with, and they're part of my own vocabulary. So if I'm complicit, I'm complicit down to the core. There's a part of my soul that is connected to those sounds. But also Jordan's statement from his book, where he, you know, I think you could call it naive. I think he'd probably welcome that accusation. But the idea that you know, if you truly think that what we're doing could improve things, could improve possibilities for interpretation, could improve possibilities for art within these environments, there's no reason to assume out the gate that you're going to have an adversarial relationship with the entities that are the gatekeepers to these kinds of things, and to try and find a way to work within those systems is maybe you can succeed in getting them to be complicit with you, as opposed to it merely being a matter of you being complicit to them and their aims. And there's no reason that if that ends up being a beneficial position for them to take, there's no reason to believe they wouldn't go there. But yeah, these issues are really fraught, and there are things that I think about. The sound that the chemistry building was making, you know, exists primarily. It's there because we want people in the chemistry lab to be safe. We want research to continue in there, and if a chemistry experiment goes bad and you need to evacuate all the air out of one of the labs to save lives quickly, like, really great that we have that technology. I can't fault anyone for building that. if a little more effort was put into making that sound more enclosed or less affecting of that environment, yeah, would that be possible? Yeah, probably. And is there a reason why that effort was or was not put in in that location? And to me, that's part of the question that the piece I was making was asking. And of course, that kind of a noise situation, that was the site I was given to work in. But you can ask that question of a lot of different sites within, certainly within the city of Chicago, that I would walk through.
And I just want to add one small thing. When you're working in these big institutions, and when you're working with people that you disagree with, like, you know, who's paying you? Who's giving you this money? And where does that money come from? This is something that we talked about in the paper, and we mentioned it in our discussion. And, you know, it depends on who you are, but I don't mind taking money from bad people and doing something good with it. Actually, I'll do that all day, every day.
It feels like you're passing, you're laundering it back to some kind of positivity, maybe.
Yeah, I think like this also feels related to another kind of like part of the project that Erik and I were part of that we didn't really mention in our talk, but I think in writing that essay, like, I thought a lot about this segment where we were working with Community Music Works, which is like a really great like music school that gives like free classical music education, mostly to students in Providence public schools, which is like pretty chronically like underfunded, especially in terms of arts programming. And so I just felt like that was an instance where maybe like these questions of like complicity and the degrees to which we're able to transform the like kind of givens that we're asked to work with like really came into play. I think it felt to our collective like there were a lot of parallels between Community Music Works, like their kind of like praxis, because they like mostly teach classical music. And when we spoke with them and we were talking about their organization, I remember Erik asked like about their choice to use like a pretty like white genre, very white genre. Yeah, like we're all in the music department, so we could go into this, but Erik asked about that, and kind of an answer that a student who was sitting in on our conversation, a student at Community Music Works, gave is that like in the end it doesn't totally matter the genre because we're all just like sounding together. But I think like that was I think a really like a key moment for us, like to like kind of hear that and reframe the ways we're thinking about like whether how it matters that like modes of expression are constrained. But yeah, also just wanted to say that that was just an interesting moment because CMW, Community Music Works, and Brown, although completely different, are also have a lot of parallels in terms of being nonprofits and like the funding structures and needing to, in some ways, like offer educational experiences that work with like the donors that like fund us. So I don't know if you want to add to that, Erik.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I appreciate this conversation too, because it's really bringing up for me questions of like harm and how we assess who is harmed and how we kind of like not rank, but really how we evaluate that harm, right? Even the question, like you were talking about, of the safety of the students in the chemistry department, right? And the potential kind of harm done on folks who are around and having to listen to this sound. And I think that is really at the heart of wrestling with this complicity question, is how do you evaluate and measure harm done to communities, to yourself, or how you're a part of that inflicting that harm on a community, and is there a degree to which your harming is acceptable because it is able to do some kind of good, right? So I'm thinking a lot about when you're mentioning community music works. My dissertation research was about community-based recording studios, and they were always making these kinds of negotiations where it was like, okay, well, we're going to treat the space like it's a community center. So kids won't be able to swear when they're on the mic, and they have to have a certain dress code when they come in this space. And, you know, it takes on this very carceral, you know, space. But at the same time, the way that they're making that negotiation is that well, that allows us to get money, that allows us to get funding so that we can have this space so that kids can come in and get on the mic and learn, you know, Pro Tools and be able to engage with these tools. And so it's not clear if the harm done to them by censoring them or saying the way that you dress is not acceptable rubs up against the opening up of this space that allows them to speak, you know, some of their stories into existence. So it's really, really complicated. And I think harm and kind of listening and is like part of that, figuring out there's like concentric circles, but which communities are marginalized, and trying to listen to their conversations about what harm looks like for them, I think is how we try to navigate this.
Thank you all so much. This is really powerful. We're a little past time. I would love to go on for much longer. I have many more questions, but I'm really grateful for all of your insights. I might just put a quick concluding note on this to add that talking to you, interacting with your materials made me think, going back to Adrienne Marie Brown, made me think of pleasure and what that consists of. Knowing that perhaps leaning into discomfort, maybe despite or because conversations or sounds may not be conventionally comfortable or sonorous, there can still be pleasure derived from active engagement with these materials. So I'm grateful to you all for bringing these ideas to the fore. It was wonderful to see you virtually. So this will conclude our morning panel discussion. Please join us later today for more Residual Noise events. You can see the schedule online. There's a panel this afternoon and concert in the evening. Yes, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Kristina. And thanks to all the panelists. So good to hear your talks.
Thank you.